Hello.
It's hello.
Hello. Hello?
Hello there.
Welcome back to the Space Gulag. Today we're going to find out what would have happened had Padmé survived Revenge of the Sith. Before we begin this video, special thanks to our patrons, voice actors, and everyone else part of my team. If you want a chance to win in our next giveaway, watch to the end of the video and I'll tell you exactly how you can win a free lightsaber. Our story begins on Mustafar. Two brothers were interlocked in an intense battle. Skywalker and Kenobi were fighting on top of a floating platform in the middle of a lava river. Anakin was a magnificent duelist, and even more than that, he was fighting against the Master of Defense. It also was to no surprise that Obi-Wan was holding his own. He was the one who taught Anakin after all. Obi-Wan held his own under the excruciating heat of the Mustafar air. Explosions filled the skies as fire rained down. It was poetic in a sense. Master and apprentice holding out their final duel here on Hell itself. Skywalker pushed harder and harder, and then the two of them broke off from one another. Anakin told Obi-Wan that this was going to be the end for him. He looked at his former student quietly as he took it all in. This was going to be the end of one of them. Obi-Wan held his blade up and then blocked two strikes from Anakin before leaping backwards and landing on top of a lava bank. Obi-Wan looked down at Skywalker as he shrugged his shoulders. He knew this was going to define their entire contest. He looked down into the eyes of Vader. Anakin was clearly no longer home. The person was too vile to be Anakin. Obi-Wan told Vader that this contest was over. He had the high ground. Of course, Obi-Wan knew it was all about deception. Vader would get too cocky and it would cost himself the battle if he got too carried away. It wouldn't just be losing the battle, it could very well be the death of him. But Obi-Wan had to be willing to commit to that if it was the case. Vader called out, telling Obi-Wan that he underestimated his powers. Obi-Wan under his breath told Vader not to try it, but it was too late. Vader was already flying through the air towards him. Obi-Wan had two choices: jab forward and stab Anakin, or swing his lightsaber to the side and just cut off limbs. Obi-Wan chose to jab his blade forward as he connected with Anakin's stomach and dragged him around to the ground. Obi-Wan gasped as he realized what he did, and then he looked down next to him. His student was groaning in pain. Obi-Wan looked down and instantly pulled Anakin's lightsaber from his hand with the Force and looked into Anakin's eyes. Obi-Wan stabbed Anakin in the stomach, and now he was laying on the ground coughing on air. Obi-Wan looked at Anakin and thought back to Satine, and before her, Qui-Gon Jinn. Both of them stabbed in the stomach by a lightsaber, and Obi-Wan had just done the same thing to his very own apprentice. Obi-Wan's natural reaction was to lean down and help, but Anakin's yellow eyes dissuaded him from thinking it was an appropriate time to try and do so. Anakin looked at Obi-Wan, and all Kenobi could do was think of the words to say. Anakin at this point felt that he was going to die. Had he lost his limbs, there was a chance for him to survive, but there was nothing that would stop him from dying here. There was a chance for him to use the dark side to keep himself alive, but because his thoughts drifted to Padmé, he didn't even consider trying to keep himself alive. He just looked at his former master and thought about the death that was knocking on his door. Anakin's eyes were present, even if they were hidden under the yellow haze of hate. Skywalker reached up with his hand, offering his hand in a truce to Obi-Wan. Kenobi's eyes filled with tears, but he couldn't show it, but they lined the inside of his eyes. Obi-Wan leaned down and took Anakin's hand. Obi-Wan told Anakin that he was sorry for everything. Anakin looked up into the air, droning out as he thought about what the afterlife would hold for him. Anakin looked over at Obi-Wan and asked his master if it was all worth it. Obi-Wan knelt down and placed his hand under Anakin's head, and told him it was always worth it. Obi-Wan told Anakin and understood. He would have done anything for Satine to stay alive, but he never would have hurt anyone for that. Anakin sighed. He told Obi-Wan that from the deepest part of his heart, he was truly sorry for what he'd done. He lost control, but with death knocking on his door, he had no reason to not realize what his actions had caused the galaxy. Anakin put his arm around, and even as much pain as it caused him, he placed it on Obi-Wan's shoulder and begged that he take care of Padmé and their child for him. Anakin didn't know that there were going to be twins. He just assumed it was going to be one. Obi-Wan looked at Anakin. It was Anakin. His blue eyes returned. Obi-Wan felt the desire to do something, but could he really do it? He lost two of the most important people in his life, and yet he was about to lose the third in this same position. Obi-Wan knew that there was a chance that this could go extremely wrong, but he also couldn't live with losing another person that he cared so deeply about in his hands. Obi-Wan looked at Anakin and asked him if he could do it over again, would he do it the same way? Anakin shook his head. A tear fell down the scar on his eye as his voice cracked. He told Obi-Wan that he would have talked to him before he left for Utapau. He would have done something differently. He wouldn't have marched on the temple. The children especially never needed to be killed in the way they were. Anakin admitted that he disliked the council, but he needed them. He needed them to be there for him, and they weren't. Obi-Wan told Anakin that there was always a chance for redemption. Anakin told Obi-Wan that he would do anything to make it right, but unfortunately, he didn't have the time anymore. Obi-Wan smiled at Anakin and told him that the light side of the Force was more powerful than he could possibly imagine. Obi-Wan placed his hand on Anakin's wound and closed his eyes. Moments later, the wound healed. Anakin's eyes shot open as he looked at Obi-Wan, asking what had just happened. Obi-Wan's head dropped down. A tear fell from his eye. He told Anakin that after Satine died, he vowed that he wouldn't lose another person in his arms. And so, he asked Yoda, the Grand Master, to teach him Force Heal. It was more commonly used during the era of High Republic, but it faded out of popularity, and Yoda stopped teaching it because no one ever used it. Anakin looked at Obi-Wan and asked if Force Heal was an ability all this time, and that he murdered so many people for no reason. Obi-Wan nodded his head, and he looked away. Anakin caught his breath and leaned up. He looked at Obi-Wan and apologized for everything, but Obi-Wan was silent. He couldn't muster up the ability to say a word or even look at Anakin. He just looked at the ground, his hands covered in dust and empty. Obi-Wan's mind fell back onto Satine and Qui-Gon. If only he'd known how to do this, maybe it'd all be different. He looked over to his right and locked eyes with Anakin. His apprentice wrapped his arms around his master and stuttered on his words, trying to find anything to say when not enough words would be able to compensate for his actions. No amount of apologies would ever be able to atone for what he had done. Anakin's arms tightened around his master. Obi-Wan lightly placed his arms around his student as Kenobi felt limp. He wasn't weakened from using Force Heal. He was just processing what he did. Anakin got up and reached down with his hand to help Obi-Wan up. Obi-Wan looked at him, took a deep breath, and then he reached up as he was helped up to his feet. Anakin looked down, and then the sound of a shuttle caught his attention. It was the Emperor. Obi-Wan straightened his back. Yoda wasn't able to kill Sidious. Whether or not he was still alive didn't matter. Obi-Wan needed to finish his job with or without Anakin. Skywalker looked over with a grin on his face. He nudged Obi-Wan and told him that he had an idea. Obi-Wan looked at him and listened. The ship landed and Lord Sidious exited the shuttle. Shock troopers got out and looked around the area. At the same time, a few royal guards piled out of the shuttle in formation behind their emperor. He told them to station themselves here. He then looked forward. The shock troopers ran forward. It was Skywalker and Kenobi. Sidious thought this was rather peculiar, but he waited patiently, telling his shock troopers to wait and see what Skywalker had to say. Anakin walked forward and bowed, and so did Kenobi. Anakin called Sidious his master and told him that he was able to convince Obi-Wan to join the Empire. Sidious's expression was priceless. He genuinely didn't know how to process what Anakin just said. He came to Mustafar under the impression that Anakin was in trouble, and yet Anakin was standing here with another Sith, apparently. Sidious stuttered on his words as he tried to come up with a response. He only wanted Anakin, but he figured Kenobi could be a powerful ally, in the same respect that Ventress was a powerful ally to Dooku. So maybe this could work. Sidious didn't even think of this being a trick, because Anakin had gone and done so much, there was little to no chance that Obi-Wan would be able to ever forgive Anakin for his actions, or let alone go along with a plan like this. Sidious thought for a moment. Kenobi then did something he never thought he'd do. He got down on his knee and bowed his head. Skywalker looked down, even he was taken aback. Obi-Wan was all in on this plan, surprisingly. Sidious started to snicker as he walked forward. Anakin walked over to his new master and got by his side, as Sidious dropped his lightsaber out of his robes into his hand. As he ignited the lightsaber, and before he could kill Obi-Wan, Anakin ripped his lightsaber into Sidious's back. The royal guards leapt into action as Obi-Wan ignited his own lightsaber and stabbed Sidious in the chest, and then rolled off of him. Anakin moved his lightsaber around as he told Obi-Wan that he would always have his back. Kenobi looked at his apprentice with a weak smile formed across his face. The shock troopers were all in shock, ironically, and the royal guards were too, as they all went after the two Jedi. It didn't take more than a minute for all of them to be killed. Obi-Wan moved over to make sure Sidious was dead. He was cut into two pieces, but he had to ensure. The dark side was powerful, and so he dragged both halves of Sidious to the edge and tossed his body into the lava below. Anakin watched as Obi-Wan dropped the second half of Sidious into the lava river below. The two of them ran back to the ship that Kenobi arrived in. Padmé was missing, though C-3PO was waiting as he told them that he carried Padmé into the vessel. The two ran inside as Anakin ran to his wife's side, and Obi-Wan made his way to the cockpit and pulled the ship out off of the dreary atmosphere of Mustafar. Obi-Wan launched the ship into hyperspace towards Polis Massa. While the ship was in hyperspace, Obi-Wan came back to check on Padmé. She was okay. She had had a moment where she was awake and she saw Anakin. She was able to rest a little bit more comfortably, knowing that her husband was nearby. The shock of what had happened to her seemed to escape her mind. Obi-Wan and Anakin would eventually find themselves in a cockpit, talking about everything. Anakin told what happened and how it happened. Obi-Wan surprisingly understood. Not that Obi-Wan would have chosen Palpatine over Windu, but for Anakin to have to choose the man who believed in him or the man who disregarded him wasn't much of a competition. Had someone like Yoda, Obi-Wan, or even Plo Koon been there, maybe it would have been different, a much different scenario. Anakin then asked about Obi-Wan's scenario. Obi-Wan expressed that he never had to look at his own men under Order 66. They just turned on him and shot him off of a mountain. He fought members of the 501st and he wasn't exactly proud of it. He'd known Appo forever and still he gutted him on the steps of the Jedi Temple. Several other clones he knew he had to kill, and it felt awful. Both of them were able to express the difficulties of their own struggles, finding a little bit of a common ground. Anakin understood that he would have to pay for his crimes, but Obi-Wan shook his head. He told Anakin that technically he didn't break the law, and Jedi didn't take revenge. He'd be able to get off and begin a life that he always wanted. Somehow, in the end, it worked out perfectly for Anakin. Anakin would be able to live with Padmé and begin his own life with their family. For Kenobi, he'd have to pick up the pieces and probably find Maul, considering Ahsoka's vessel never made it back to Coruscant. And knowing how great of an escape artist Maul was, the chances of him escaping were nearly 100%. Their conversation ended when they reached Polis Massa, and they had to immediately get Padmé to a medical bay. Anakin carried her down the side of the ramp and ran with her in his arms. Obi-Wan noticed that the Tantive 4 was waiting outside of the landing bay. It meant that at the very least Bail Organa had gotten here. When Anakin rounded the corner, he smiled and said hello to the senator who was standing in the hallway as he turned another corner to get Padmé to a medical bay. Obi-Wan came in behind Anakin and looked at Bail, whose face almost turned pale. He saw Anakin and panicked. Obi-Wan stood in front of Bail and told him that he turned Anakin back to the light. Bail looked at Obi-Wan with concern on his face. Yoda came down the hall. He felt the presence of Skywalker and was prepared to fight him to the death, but he saw Obi-Wan and Bail talking. Maybe it was okay, as if nothing had happened. Obi-Wan explained what had happened and Yoda couldn't lie. He was disappointed that Obi-Wan used the ability on the same man who almost destroyed the entire Jedi Order. It was a bit disappointing for him, but in a way he understood why Obi-Wan did it, especially as Obi-Wan explained his reasons for doing so. And also, Obi-Wan and Anakin killed Sidious. The three of them walked around the corner that Anakin had gone moments before. He was standing by his wife's side holding her hand. The three silently watched for nearly 2 hours until the birth of Luke and Leia Skywalker. Anakin was filled with joy, but his heart was swollen with pain. Even though he finally had everything he wanted, he had to live with what he did. Padmé was taken to rest and the two children were put in incubators for the time being. Skywalker was with his wife while she rested. Obi-Wan and Yoda talked about the possible future for the Jedi. Bail informed them that with Palpatine dead, it would be a question of what the Senate could do without him. Padmé and Bail had influential voices, but Bail admitted that there would probably never be a republic again. It would stay an empire, but they needed to ensure the empire was democratic in all respects. The three of them set up a plan, though Obi-Wan informed Yoda that he would be searching for Maul. Considering Anakin would be able to take care of the children, Obi-Wan would go find and stop the last Sith, being Maul. Obi-Wan also needed some time alone after what he had done. This wasn't a quest for exile, but more so a desire to find inner peace within himself. Yoda would have to decide on what he would do. Bail, of course, was already reaching out to others within the Imperial Senate to get ideas on who would become the new Emperor, in quotations, but they needed to bring back democracy and keep power away from an autocracy. Obi-Wan would leave Polis Massa without saying anything to Anakin, taking a local vessel into the Outer Rim, assuming that's where Maul was going after the Siege of Mandalore. Obi-Wan referred back to his knowledge of Maul before the death of Savage. Obi-Wan could have said something to Anakin, but he really didn't know how to feel. He failed as student. Anakin destroyed the Jedi and the Sith. There was something that felt lacking in Obi-Wan's heart. His heart was crushed, after all. Anakin and Padmé would eventually be able to move back to Coruscant, in which Anakin would be able to apologize to Yoda before leaving. Yoda would go out in searching for Jedi younglings and Padawans, especially the most vulnerable survivors of Order 66. The next 2 months would be drastically different. Everyone went their own separate ways. Anakin, while understanding why Obi-Wan left Polis Massa without saying anything, was rather saddened. He was struggling really badly. Padmé was trying to be there for him, but currently she and Bail were turning the Empire into a democratic empire, which at the moment was functioning, kind of. The only issue is without Palpatine, Tarkin took a hold of the Imperial militaristic structure and went on the offensive, and they also got rid of the clone army production at Kamino. It was a really tense galaxy, but the Empire was coming close to electing a Chancellor into power. They would also be electing a Vice-Chancellor, instead of having an Emperor. The election was coming up and Padmé had her name in the hat, so she was trying to earn popularity, especially since Mothma and Organa were in the same ballot for Vice-Chancellor and Chancellor. Anakin suffered a lot alone. He had no friends. He didn't have contact for Obi-Wan or Yoda, and he was convinced that Ahsoka and Rex died, which both of them were still hiding out in the Outer and Mid-Rim without interacting with anybody. Anakin did have his children, but he lived a great deal of his life with a lot of depression. He was sickened by his actions and he hardly slept, filled with nightmares. Obi-Wan had tracked down Maul and during this time, snuck into the ranks of Crimson Dawn without Maul noticing. This resulted in an epic duel that resulted in the death of not just Maul, but his head man, Dryden Voss, too. For the first time, Sith would be completely wiped out from existence. The Senate would return to democracy and the Imperial military would slow down on its behavior. Dale would have the fortune of being elected the first Chancellor of the Empire, and the Vice-Chancellor would be a more militaristic individual, but the two of them would provide a nice balance for the Imperial Senate. Anakin would struggle, but when Obi-Wan returned to his life, he would finally be able to find some sort of happiness. It would take time for Anakin, but he would also be able to recover and find peace and come to peace with what he had done during that one night. Obi-Wan and Ahsoka would become uncle and aunt-like figures and retire from being Jedi, while Yoda spent the rest of his life building up an order that was lost. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our short story today. Again, special thanks to Benjamin Wells, Jonathan, Pimp Daddy Bane. I'm keeping that in. IC Raptor, Apollo, Mad Meta Studios, Anakin003, and Gort for supporting the channel. Let's see those likes in this video. Got a full movie coming out for you guys tomorrow. I'm going to be out of town, so that's part of the reason why this video is short, and it's also why there's a full movie coming out tomorrow. If you want to see what else, let me know below. In the comments, want to do a crossover, check out the community Discord, the Twitch, and the Patreon, supporting other ways. Want to learn how to win a free lightsaber, go down below. There is a doc. You click on the doc, you write your name on the doc. Giving away 3 lightsabers at 50,000 subscribers, and we are currently on the trajectory to hit that, so smash that like button, share, subscribe, do all the things. Let's talk about our story. So I know the story literally says, what if Padmé survived? And let's just be real here. Padmé doesn't survive unless Anakin is either alive or dead. So this could go 2 ways. Anakin could die, and Padmé lives, or she could live, and Padmé would die. And I figured, since we did 2 dark stories in a row, I might as well have some fun with a light side story. And I wanted to do something different. Obviously, we already did What If Obi-Wan Saved Anakin, and in that story, Padmé did survive. So I couldn't just copy that. I couldn't just rehash something that was already done before. Of course not. So I decided to kind of do some imagery with the death of Satine and Qui-Gon, where Anakin is stabbed and he doesn't have his limbs lost. He still has his limbs, but Obi-Wan has to come to the obligation of having to decide, does he let his only apprentice die in his hands, or does he save him? And now, I know Force Heal is a touchy subject for everyone in the Star Wars community, so let's just shut up and have a fun time talking about it, obviously. Now, when I talked about Force Heal here, I didn't want to go too in-depth with it. I just wanted to be kind of simple, very, very relaxed conversation. It's just Yoda and Obi-Wan had a moment, and Obi-Wan told Yoda that he wished he could save his friend, and Yoda expressed that there are always ways to save people, and essentially from there, that's how Obi-Wan learned how to Force Heal. Obviously, it's probably not a canon thing. I don't think Obi-Wan knows how to Force Heal, but for the story purpose, it was to be like poetry. As good George always said, it's like poetry and it rhymes, and that's kind of what I do here with these stories. I always try and pay homage to the work that George created. It's always going back to what he did. So in a way, it's like poetry. It just rhymes. The death of Qui-Gon, the death of Satine, and the almost death of Anakin. That's kind of where the story was based off of. Anakin gets to live his life. That's really the moral of the story. He gets to live his life. And Padme, well, she's going to be in politics. She just goes back to doing her job. It's really, like, quite simple. I mean, I really don't know how else to convey it. I mean, Luke and Leia are going to be trained by Anakin, but as for Obi-Wan, the most compelling arc, I believe, in this story, my personal opinion, is Obi-Wan's, because he has to live with saving the person that literally ripped apart the Jedi Order and just committed treason against everything he knew. And he had to live with that. Like, that choice for Obi-Wan is, like, really depressing. Like, he either loses his apprentice in the same way he lost the person he loved the most and his master, or he lets his apprentice die the same way he lost his love interest, and his master. So, with that being said, I hope you all enjoyed this short story. I know it's rather short for even for me. This is rather pretty short, but I hope you all enjoyed. I'm working on the part 2 and part 3 for the Yoda videos, and I'm really excited for that. That is like the pride of what I'm working on right now. I'm really excited for that full story to come out. So join us with Athema and Yoda in part 2, probably on Tuesday or something. Anyways, I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.